Good afternoon. My name is Walter Willett, and I'm professor of epidemiology and nutrition at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. Most of my research over the years has been on diet and health, and more recently this has expanded to include the effects of diet on the environment, which of course is critical for human health in general. I'm sorry I can't be there with you this afternoon, but I should be by this time on my way to the Menus of Change conference. This is a conference we sponsor together with the Culinary Institute for America, where we bring together leaders from large institutions, food services, large restaurant chains, even McDonald's, to try to embed some more attention to the effects of diet on both health and sustainability in their policies. I was also privileged to be co-chair of the EAT-Lancet Commission that looked at a possible pathway to providing the world's population a diet that is both healthy and sustainable. And of course, I think most people here realize the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions that are driving climate change does come from fossil fuels. But about a third of the greenhouse gas emissions do come from the food system. We looked deeply into how that might be limited or decreased as part of our EAT-Lancet Commission. And we found that there are three main changes, three pillars of change that have to happen. First, to shift the composition of the diets that we consume to be more plant-based, not necessarily vegan, but to emphasize healthy plant foods. Second, to reduce food loss and waste. And third, to make our agricultural systems more efficient. But by far the biggest change we need to make is to shift our diets in a healthy, more sustainable direction. And that will be the topic of today's discussion. If the world were ideal, we would have strong national leadership taking charge of this. But unfortunately, in this country, the Department of Agriculture has really abdicated responsibility. In fact, the leadership of the USDA has said they won't even suggest that people reduce their consumption of red meat for benefiting both health and climate change. So that means it's really up to cities, other institutions, states to provide leadership in this area. And the good thing is that some institutions, some states, some cities are really stepping up. And this is important because it's not just the food that they serve, but also the example that they set. They can make big impacts by procurement policies that emphasize sustainable, healthy foods, but also for universities, we know that we're training leaders who will go forth, become the heads of many groups, both in business and policy in this country and around the world. And if they take knowledge about food systems with them, they can provide the leadership that we desperately need. But fortunately, some systems are stepping up. Fortunately, some cities are stepping up, as I mentioned briefly, for example, Boston and New York City, and that's incredible. I hope you'll hear more about that today. In this panel, we will have several amazing faculty members here from Harvard. Emily Leib, who runs the Harvard Law School Food Law and Policy Clinic. This focuses on food waste, food recovery, food access, nutrition, justice, climate, and sustainability. I've worked with Emily on a number of projects. She's amazing, and I know you're going to hear an amazing presentation. Spasha Shaha is also a faculty member at our university, and she has a course, really the first course at our university on this topic called The Great Food Transformation. This was inspired by the EAT-Lancet report, and she covers environmental health, ethical costs associated with the current food system, policies, politics, everything that we need to address if we're going to find solutions that will be effective. I know this will be a great session. I anticipate that everyone will be inspired to take steps wherever you are to move us in the direction that we definitely need if we are going to pass on to future generations a viable planet.
Great, well, thank you, Walter. What a great framing for today's discussion. And he mentioned the EAT-Lancet report. If you haven't checked that out, I highly recommend that you do. The EAT-Lancet report 2.0 is coming out soon. And Walter actually emailed me just this morning to say that he and his colleagues published a paper just yesterday in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition that measures the health and environmental impact of a planetary health diet as kind of defined in the EAT-Lancet report. And no surprise, a planetary health diet was associated with lower risk of deaths from cardiovascular disease, cancer, respiratory diseases, and neurodegenerative diseases. And so I highly recommend you checking out that paper. And now let's get started. So I'm David Havelick. I'm an associate director in the Harvard Office for Sustainability, where we're translating the latest research and thinking into practice here on our campus and trying to walk the walk. Here at Harvard, of course, we have a responsibility to lead. People are watching what we're doing. We launched our Sustainable and Healthful Food Standards, which you can find on our website in 2019. Walter, Emily, who's on the panel, contributed to those standards, and our food vendors and also our community can look to those for guidance and how to be improving our food system here on campus over time. We were also an inaugural signatory of the Cool Food Pledge here at Harvard, which is a group of large organizations and cities who are aiming to reduce their food-related greenhouse gas emissions by 25% by 2030. Although when New York signed on, they even are aiming to be more ambitious, which is exciting. And here at Harvard, we serve over 10 million meals a year, and so far we've reduced our emissions related to food by about 16% per meal, and continuing to make progress. And I'm really excited about the topic of this panel because, as Walter said, food and agriculture represents about a third of emissions. And so it's really important for us to talk about this. And in addition, we know some of the ways to be moving the needle in the right direction: more plant-based food, less food waste and loss. But to do that work is really complicated. And so today we're going to hear from two cities and some scholars here at Harvard about how we can kind of work together and really leverage our institutions and our knowledge to make change. So we're going to start with each person one at a time, and then we'll just open it up for discussion among us, and then we'll open it up to the crowd at the end. So let me start with Kate here, Kate McKenzie. She's the executive director of New York City Mayor's Office of Food Policy. She advises the mayor on all things food, and among other things, helped usher that city commitment to reduce food-related emissions. So welcome to Kate.
Thanks so much, David. It's really a treat to be here, to see some old friends, some colleagues, and to have this session at a climate conference. And I understand that this is the first time in the space where we're acknowledging the role of food in our climate emergency. I have been in food systems work for more than 20 years, and historically really coming from a place of income insecurity and nutrition security, and in my current position really wanted to grow the understanding of how cities need to take a firmer action when it comes to our climate crisis. And Mayor Eric Adams, who has been the mayor of New York City for the past 2 years, has been such a champion of that. If you know anything about New York City, you know that it's big, you know that you don't really think about farming, you don't really think about the opportunities to connect what you're eating to our climate emergency. But what Mayor Adams has done is connect our legacy and connections about nutrition and food standards to our healthcare, to our climate crisis. In fact, one of his many lines around this is we can no longer feed our healthcare crisis. And he's gone so far at a moment that I'll describe in just a moment about just this past year, about how much we really need to start talking about beef, and we need to start talking about dairy. And the minute you call, this is why, and I so appreciate in the video recognizing that for a government leader to address that, to name that, is tricky, but we like to follow the data. And we know that we are not saying we should never be eating meat. We are not saying that dairy is evil by any stretch of the imagination, but we're saying that we need to be conscious about the role that our food system has on the environment. So just a few things I wanted to draw attention to. I have an incredible luxury and privilege and responsibility to make sure that New York City's, all of our agencies are addressing food systems in some way. Now, we are the country's largest buyer of food, secondary only to the Department of Defense. So we use that power of procurement in many different ways. In our school system, we've introduced what we call Plant-Powered Fridays, which is where we feature a plant-forward item on the menu. And as a public school parent, I get the reviews all the time. And I know that, especially with kids, repeated exposures is important. And particularly amongst kids, introducing new options and introducing them again and again is necessary to develop lifelong habits. But to be clear, these are always offered in a sense of a choice. If a kid does not want the vegetable tahini that we might be offering, or the 3-bean kidney rajma that might be offered, there are certainly other options that are available to them, but it's these repeated exposures that are essential. We operate 11 public hospitals in our city, and similar to what we're doing in the school system, we have made the plant-based item for inpatients the default item. So if you are unfortunately having to go in for a procedure, and then the meal clerk comes around and says, what would you like to eat? Here's our menu. The options there are plant forward. If you're like, I'm not so sure about that one, the next option is a plant-based food item. And then if you're really like, I want that meatloaf, of course you can have that. But it is really by introducing these behavioral nudges and defaults to get people to, when else, if not in a moment of healthcare emergency and need, in a public hospital, make sure that we're introducing healthier options for individuals, and then packaging those with a recipe cookbook or tips to take home with the patient for their time of healing. So we have, as David mentioned, made a commitment to reduce the carbon footprint of our food purchases by 30% by 2030. We are on a path to do that, but it's also not just as a city overall, but every agency, from our homeless services to our Department of Correction is really important in that work as well. These are just a few of the ways in which we are acknowledging the role of climate. Something that's particularly vexing, and thinking about some of the sessions that you've probably heard, is calculating the impact of our emissions. Just last year, we introduced an integrated inventory when we consider scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, your classic sort of buildings and transportations. Food is nearly number 2. It's just coming in at number 3 in the scope from a consumption-based emissions perspective. But for my colleagues in climate and environmental justice in the Sister Mayor's office, this is a head scratcher, right? Particularly food. Our emissions happen not in New York City. They happen at the source of origin and on the farm, and that's really hard, particularly again, as David mentioned, when you're thinking about what are the levers that we can pull to ultimately shift the composition of diets. So from a city perspective, we have an imperative, we have a responsibility to not just address individual health, but planetary health. That's our desire to shift our diets, thinking about what Walt said also, reducing food loss and waste. We're expanding curbside composting, requiring all schools to separate organics. And then finally, something that many people don't realize, in our Department of Environmental Protection, just to hit the third bucket there of efficient agricultural systems, we, outside of the city, we have an abundant, one of the world's cleanest water supplies, and our agricultural water, our watershed is surrounded by agricultural lands. We invest hundreds of millions of dollars into best management practices at the farm level to maintain that water system. And so these are ways that it might be working with a dairy farm, but increasingly it's also supporting fruit and vegetable growers in climate-friendly practices as well. So this is an area of emergence for us, an area that we hope to partner more with our state agriculture department and practices there, because just because we have a lot of community gardens and farms in New York City, we also have a role to influence and shape efficient agricultural systems. I really look forward to being in conversation with my colleagues and to taking some of your questions. And again, just appreciate and ask you to help bring more people into this session next year at this conference too.
Thank you, Kate. Really exciting. And so now we're going to move more locally to the city of Boston. Elisa Wasserman is the director of the Office of Food Justice here in the city of Boston. And she has a couple slides to share. She's working on things related to food waste reduction, urban agriculture, good food purchasing program, and you have the slide. Right, let me just switch you to the slides. Just 1 second. There we go. And welcome, Elisa.
Thank you. Thanks so much, David. Really appreciate Boston being included in this session, even though we're just down the street. I don't always get opportunities to come talk to folks in the, I'm sure, vast variety of roles that you all are in currently and will be in the future. So it's exciting. I, as David mentioned, I think I've never had one of these before. I'm the director of the Office of Food Justice for the City of Boston. We have had an Office of Food Justice since 2022, and at that point when our current mayor, Mayor Wu, created the Office of Food Justice and our sibling department or office, Grow Boston, which is the city's Office of Urban Agriculture. Our office also was moved into what is a cabinet of environment, energy, and open space within the city, and the idea is that this will give us increasingly moving forward opportunities to really weave in work to address the food system's impact on the climate more seamlessly into our work, which had historically been really focused on food access, things like farmers markets, etc. And so our work now is really integrating those streams. And I'll just add that is under the leadership of, we actually just as of yesterday have a chief climate officer in the city of Boston, Brian Sweat, who started yesterday. And so it's exciting to think about more that will be coming up as we continue to put these together. I'm gonna talk mostly about a newer area of work for us on food waste and specifically redistribution of food that is safe and edible for folks to eat. So I'm not gonna go through all of these stats, but a couple that stand out of like some of the reasons we see this as one of the ways we can really impact the city's climate impact is both obviously the carbon emissions, but also that methane emitted from landfills. How much of that is really coming from food and organic waste in general. And then the other reason that we are, constantly struggling to meet the increasing rates of food insecurity that we have in Boston. Just 2 weeks ago, the Greater Boston Food Banks released some new data from 2023 showing that 44% of Boston residents experienced food insecurity at some point in 2023, and that is alarmingly and not surprisingly much higher for Black and Latinx residents that who experienced 59 to 60% of Black and Latinx residents had experienced food insecurity at some point in 2023. And it's because we have a focus on food justice, we're trying to take a step back and not just look at this simplistically in terms of the idea that there is food that is wasted and people who need food, because that can really be stigmatizing. But we're looking at basically saying there are opportunities to meet immediate need while we also simultaneously develop and implement other programs, other policy and systems changes that will actually address the upstream and root causes of food insecurity, but that we can't wait for those because of the tremendous distress that folks are under, and the fact that we know that there is a lot of surplus food that could be going to residents, like as we speak. So we are partnering with Natural Resources Defense Council Food Matters Initiative, and they have started supporting us in the past year to look at, they work with cities around food waste reduction efforts, and are focused specifically on redistribution and rescue of food. And so these are estimates from NRDC around estimated food waste by sector in Boston. This is pretty similar for most cities in the United States, large cities, but for us, not surprisingly, what we learned from this is that food waste generated by the grocery and manufacturing sectors in Boston was a little bit lower than other cities, and higher education and healthcare was a little bit higher, so not surprisingly for folks who live in Metro Boston, but it really gives us kind of the data, the information that will help us determine what are the interventions we can actually develop at a municipal level. And so this is sort of similarly when NRDC calculates these estimates, they also calculate potential, what is the potential of food safety that could really be tackled sort of ambitiously and the most we could possibly achieve. So these are kind of helpful tools for us as we determine the direction to go in. Right now, we are sort of halfway through a food rescue assessment where we're working with some consultants and a local coalition to both look at the entire landscape of what is the food rescue landscape in Boston and basically to some extent Metro Boston and Eastern Massachusetts more generally, because these things don't stop obviously at municipal boundaries. And like what are the opportunities, what are the needs and the gaps that folks currently in this space are encountering, what are the levers and the interventions that a municipality like Boston could take on that would actually drastically scale the amount of food, because we know, like, this isn't an issue of scarcity. We know that there is a lot more food that is safe, healthy, and fresh that could be we could be eating, all of us. So the idea is not that it's for certain people, but that everyone in Boston is eating rescued food. I don't want to say all of the time, but potentially all, like, more frequently, and that it's destigmatized in that way. And so we hope that when we have the results of this assessment later in the summer, it will help us determine some of the directions that we go in. But one direction we're sort of looking at is we were able through C40 and NRDC and some other international partners, some of our team members were able to study, go to Milan, Italy, and study the model that they have sort of citywide to have a more coordinated system of food rescue, which some elements of that are present in different parts of the United States in different ways, but not necessarily all of them together in such a coordinated way. And so these are just pictures. On the left are from Milan, and on the right are from a small hub in Jamaica Plain that actually is that popped up during the pandemic that's kind of doing a similar thing, but just on a smaller scale. So we are sort of looking at the potential of things like better coordination, coordinated access to cold storage on a sort of massive scale that would allow increased donations and the logistics of getting food to people to be a lot faster and at a increased scale. And finally, through this assessment, we're connecting with people in Boston who are getting food from food distribution sites and food pantries to understand their thoughts, their needs, their ideas for for both food rescue and the emergency food system in general, as well as those organizations, those pantries that either are receiving food or could be, to understand what they think the city could be doing to actually shift this, so that anything that we pursue is directly informed by the folks who are supposedly supposed to be benefiting from the emergency food system, but often the decisions are made not by them. So I think I'll just say briefly, we are also early on in our work to implement a good food purchasing standards ordinance, which was passed in Boston in 2019. And the goals of this are really to use we have a smaller purse than New York City does, but to use the purchasing power of city contracts for food, which for us are mostly in the public schools, to actually shift the food system if kind of all of our cities and all of our institutions like Harvard kind of work together. What is the potential there to really shift to food producers and all throughout sort of the supply chain, ways that we treat our planet better, treat our people and our animals better essentially, and also generate wealth for BIPOC-owned businesses. And so we're early in that work. We're sort of in an initial assessment phase as well, and working closely with Boston Public Schools to shift their procurement practices. I'm gonna not get into all this because of time.
Thank you so much, Lisa. So that sets the stage about what two nearby cities are doing. So now we're going to move on to Sparsha and Emily to talk a little bit about, I was hoping each of you could introduce yourself, maybe talk about how you work with practitioners, policymakers, and how kind of scholarship and academics kind of can play a role here. Starting with you, Sparsha.
Yeah, first let me just say how pleased I am to be on an all-women panel where I see women leaders really leading on food in particular. And David, thank you so much for all the leadership you have done at the Office of Sustainability, putting attention on food and sustainability issues. I'm going to go off script a little bit. I do teach a course on the great food transformation, the politics of the great food transformation. I'm happy to chat more about that. But I think in my field, I forget that people don't always know what the impact of food on the environment is. And it's not just climate change. Climate change is a part of a broader spectrum of environmental outcomes that we might care about. The planetary boundaries framework is one model. So if you imagine that the planet is like a being, like imagine it's a person, there's nine indicators of health. We are we're unhealthy, very unhealthy in 6 of them. And food is the leading driver of 3, of us exceeding 3 of those, and a major component of the other 3. To give you a sense of this, to create animal-sourced foods, which are the biggest chunk of this, and not to villainize this, so I'll get back to this point in a moment, but animal agriculture really is kind of at the center of this environmental crisis. It's the single largest anthropogenic land use type. It's sprawling. It's the #1 way we use land on this planet, but it produces just 18% of all of our calories and only 37% of our protein. So it's inefficient. Because of this, it's likely also the leading cause of biodiversity loss, another core boundary that we don't really talk about, but that we should. Now, addressing this is thorny because meat, dairy, it's ultimately about our relationship to nature and to animals, which is a political relationship. So there can be a lot of backlash that occurs when you talk about it. That said, I think mayors and cities are able to be more innovative, and they show us how we can actually bring a unified, balanced approach to this discussion without villainizing these products that are important parts of people's cultures and identities, but also recognizing that there's a preciousness to them. And I see that being done in cities in really kind of powerful ways. That's it.
Thank you, Sparsha. Yeah, and then we're going to move to Emily. And sorry, I forgot to say who Sparsha was, but Walter said Sparsha is a lecturer here at the Department of Government, and several students that I've worked with have raved about her course, The Great Food Transformation, so it just seems like amazing. She's creating all these young leaders who are going to go on to do amazing things. So now introducing Emily Leib, who's a clinical professor at Harvard Law School, director of the Center for Law and Policy Innovation, and the founding director of the law school's Food Law and Policy Clinic, which does amazing work. Emily's the person I go to anything related to the food system or food waste. I always go to Emily first, and she was also, as I mentioned, one of the faculty who helped us develop sustainable, healthful food standards for Harvard, and she's also on the Presidential Committee on Sustainability here at Harvard. So, Emily?
Thank you, and I also share the thanks with David for organizing us, and also to our panelists for traveling here to be here. For Sparsha, it it's easy, we're here all the time, but even though Lisa is like across the river, getting up here, and Kate too, thank you so much, and for the amazing work that you do. So I was gonna talk briefly about what we do in the Food Law and Policy Clinic, because I think it also gives a sense of some of the resources we're working on with cities give a sense of the ways that cities are engaging with food. And then I'm gonna spend a few minutes talking about food waste because I think, I think Eliza talked a little bit about what Boston's doing, and I think I'm gonna share why it's been a really big focus for us in thinking about the impact on climate. So what we are is a law school clinic, and for those who aren't lawyers, even though we're in Harvard Law School right now, I like to give like a little PSA of what that means. What it means is that we're providing real like legal and policy resources to clients while educating students in doing that. So my job and my team's job, one of my amazing team members, Greg Norton over there, is to figure out like what are good projects that we should work on that will have impact, but that are really going to educate students. And you think about like typical clinics are really representing clients in court who can't afford representation. Our students are really learning how to make policy change. So our clients are, nonprofits, coalitions, and city governments, a lot of city governments that we're helping either them better understand the laws, understand how the way the laws function in relation to what they're trying to do. So a lot of our clients will say like, I have this great innovative idea, but it's not legal. And we'll work with them on like, what could you shift to, not give up on your dream idea? What can either you change or how can we work with you to change the laws to allow this? Because often the laws are backward looking. They're addressing challenges that happened before and someone passes a law to avoid that, but they're not necessarily forward looking on like what should the future look like? What should the food system look like? And so I think again, we're seeing amazing leadership, but we're trying to kind of be like a partner helping with that. So a couple examples of things we've done. We provide a lot of direct technical assistance to clients. Again, they can be arranged, but because we're talking cities, I'll give a few examples. So in Boston, we worked with one of Eliza's predecessors. Boston had passed a new ordinance allowing food trucks. So a lot of cities have been, over the past 2 decades, changing the way that like allowing urban agriculture has been a big thing. We thought of like agriculture occurring outside. Cities had to change their zoning rules to allow that. And allowing food trucks was a really big deal in Boston because it was like allowing someone to sell things on the city streets. They passed this ordinance. There was a lot of confusion. The city was getting an overwhelming number of phone calls. And so we worked with the city to really understand the rules and put together like training materials for the food trucks and host trainings for them. And then help answer some of the questions on the back end so that it was easier to manage this progress, which allowed a lot of Boston was really clear about like the food being healthy and having healthy options, but allowed a lot more like local economic development in the food system. So that's an example. Another, we work with the city of Washington, D.C. for a while in a variety of ways on their food waste work. One big thing we worked on with them was we were doing interviews of city officials and other organizations to help them craft what was then enacted as a waste ban, an organic waste ban in Washington, D.C. that limits the amount of food that goes to landfill. So we kind of worked behind the scenes with them for over a year to kind of put that together, and that was enacted. So those are a couple examples of like the direct work. We then do a lot of work creating resources, and some of that is like when we get the same questions from, I always give the example of I started my food policy work in rural Mississippi. Now, of course, I'm in Cambridge, Boston area. And when we see that the people in Mississippi and Boston are having the same questions and challenges, it's like, well, there must be some way to answer these questions more broadly. So we've created a lot of resources and toolkits that kind of share like what are the, what are some of the policies different cities are doing. We did one called Good Laws, Good Food, putting local food policy to work for our communities. And it was like a toolkit of a whole bunch of areas that cities were acting in to improve food access, improve sustainability in the food system. And then one thing we did during COVID that we worked with Boston and some other cities on was a really detailed legal guide for community fridges. So there was like this sudden movement during COVID of people realizing, kind of like as Eliza was talking about, there's extra food, people are really in need. A lot of them were really cool like mutual aid groups that just popped up. So we interviewed fridges in Boston, LA, New York, Chicago, and one or two in a couple other cities, and gathered all of their questions, and then partnered with programs at a couple other law schools to write a really detailed, question and answer, like who has, is there liability protection for food that goes in the fridge? Do we need to buy insurance? If we pay like a staff of a mutual aid group, what is our relationship to that person? How does that work? So those are the kinds of like resources. And then lastly, and I think this is equally as important, we're training future leaders And one of the best things about what I do is that now that I've been doing this for a long time, almost 15 years, I have a lot of former students and former staff that are in leadership positions making food policy in the federal government, in state and local governments, and on the Hill. So kind of training and educating that food is both really important for the reasons we talked about, and I know we're going to talk about more. It's really tricky to address, but that there are solutions, there are ways to build consensus and kind of improve those policies so that everyone can have more equitable access to food, healthier food, more sustainable food system. I was going to talk a little bit about food waste, but I don't want to overtake the time because I think the discussion is going to be the fun part, and I know that David's really a good conversationalist. It's going to make us have a great conversation, so I'll weave it in.
I'll make sure, yeah, and I'm sure you will too. Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you, and thank you all panelists. I wanted to linger a little bit on the role of cities and maybe think about this kind of theory of change, how cities can play a role. Kate mentioned the city as leveraging its procurement. Elisa talked about kind of city as this logistical hub for managing all this extra food. What other ways and how can cities really be this change maker? And of course, Walter talked about how we're not operating in a country where the federal government's stepping in. So maybe talk a little bit more about the role of cities.
Well, I think, and Sparsha, you mentioned this too, I know New York, and I can imagine that there's a variation of this in Boston. We have extraordinary diversity in the city, right? And so whether this is expressed in the number of Asian dialects that must be used in our school system, I think whenever we get something translated, it has to happen in 23 languages minimally. But this translates into palates, right? And translates into the way in which flavor is expressed. Even, good grief, for breakfast. It's not breakfast for many cultures if it's not hot. And so it's just really, really interesting to think about the role of cities in accommodating, by necessity, not out of privilege, different palates and norms, right? And I think this is very prominent for us as we are in the grips of an asylum seeker crisis, right? And certainly over the course of many, many pandemics and emergencies, the role of halal meals and kosher meals, and just, it is an imperative and not a nice to have. And I think that as that relates also, and we think about, I don't know, the trend almost of the word plant-based. But when you think about the cultural pathways of food, every culture is grounded in beans and grains. And how we're lifting up also from a job, culinary training and sort of job and career pathways. For many people, we're asking them to do their job differently. And that doesn't, just like if somebody were to say, I don't want you to eat this anymore or that, we have to make sure that we're equipping our culinary staff, whether it's school food staff or institutional kitchens and beyond, not just do this because it's your job now, but with the knowledge and understanding about the why. So I think, from a career pathways, we know food jobs are historically very underpaid, but how we are also creating career pathways for individuals who are, by the way, cooking more environmentally friendly, healthy, and ultimately food that is highly desirable for people. So that, I think, is part of our, again, this food, you can it's like whack-a-mole, you can hit so many different things, whether it's jobs or health or environment. And that, I think, is the great responsibility that we have in food policy.
I will add, yes, on a similar note, I think in my experience with cities, both in Boston and I used to work with the National League of Cities, so with cities around the country, cities compared to other forms of government tend to be closest to people's day-to-day experiences, which I think can be, pros and cons to that, but I think two opportunities from that are it really, it's connects to people's feeling of home. And once, you can connect to making people feel, connecting with people's sense of their home, that connects very much to food and sort of a lot of the individual cultural diets and traditions. And it also, I think, can connect people's understanding of climate and sort of like, we need a home in the future, and it's not this like theoretical abstract thing, but it's like actually, I think it gives cities an opportunity to connect to shape people's understandings of the day-to-day impacts of both their decisions and decisions of leaders and trusted individuals around them, to make some of these connections that we're starting to really deepen between food and climate. And I think the last one is also that I think shifted somewhat or deepened during the pandemic is the cities, for some cities, role an opportunity to really invest in innovation and sort of like trying things differently on a scale that's like not so small that it can't have an impact, but not so big at the federal level or even the state level that it takes like years and years. But I think you saw with federal recovery money, like a lot of cities really innovating and creating pilots and seed opportunities that can then be scaled to really do some of the policy and systems change that we're all trying to do.
And I think what's exciting is, everything that's challenging about the fact that food is so personal is what the opportunity is.
Right.
That's what's really exciting. Anyone who's afraid of thinking about food and talking about it with people should realize that because you're afraid, because it feels so challenging and intimate and personal, that's what makes it so powerful, right? So it's really exciting. Sparksha, Emily, did you want to add anything?
All I will say is I think I've heard people sort of call it the F word, right, in climate circles, because I think it can be so thorny, but just, I think these are, the cities are such good examples of where, as you said, opportunities, right, where we can actually come together around food and be collaborative across parties on food. Everyone has an interest in food, so I see a lot of hope for what we can do with it when I look at cities in particular.
Yeah.
I think there's like this unique ability, Lisa mentioned, to innovate. And I know it's hard when you think about New York. I mean, you're being innovative even though it's really freaking hard at that scale, but just, everything that gets harder, the bigger the scale of government, that there's all this opportunity for cities to try stuff. And when I think about like the majority of the interesting food policies that we've seen started in cities, like in my career working on this. So I think, in the like food waste space, there's a lot of states now that have, in Massachusetts included, that have bans on, restrictions on excess food going to landfills. But the first of all those were all cities. I think it was San Francisco, Seattle, Boulder, a couple other cities, but those were like the first wave of really like, for the first time saying, we're gonna actually like penalize businesses. We're gonna say, that the data we saw from Lisa, that, there's a lot of food wasted. Yes, some of it is not good for people, some of it's, not gonna be able to, but like you can't send it to the landfill, because once it's in the landfill, it's creating huge amounts of methane. Not only is methane a greenhouse gas, but it's extremely problematic. It's like 80 times more impactful in the short term than carbon in the atmosphere. So, like cities show that was possible, and then states are doing it on a bigger level. I think that there's challenges in doing it with cities too, because most of the landfills aren't in the cities, so it's like hard for them to enforce. But they were like, we're gonna do this thing because we see this food trash piling up on our sidewalks, and it smells bad, and there are rats, and it's gross, and it's bad for the environment, whatever. I think about in the health context too, which I know is maybe a little different from where we are, but trans fat, like the banning of trans fat, which is like a huge public health policy change in this country, started with cities, started with New York, like labeling of things on menus. So again, cities are in all of these areas, I think, are closer to the problem and have the ability to be innovative and try things out and then show the rest of us that it's possible.
Totally agree. So another quick question. So the other F word, but in a positive sense.
I don't know what those F words are.
Yeah, if they're not recording now. Is farmers and agriculture. So, Kate, you talked about how, sure, these farms aren't right there in New York, but you're having impacts or sending demand signals. Could you talk a little bit more about about the indirect and direct relationships you're having with farmers to really move farmers and agriculture?
Sure. So, one of the things that we're not getting into the weeds on here is the efforts that both New York and Boston and many other cities are doing around values-based procurement, specifically around food, right? And there's so many values. There's the health, there's environmental sustainability, animal welfare, environment, and labor, right? All these, like someone said, I think we were at another conference and it was naughty, but I was like, it could also be naughty. The implications of all of these values, and to hit them all is hard, but maybe how can we amplify one particular thing over another? So what we are doing right now is just publicizing what it is that we buy and whom do we buy it from. And you find out that this isn't like, we actually don't buy that much direct product in a form of a commodity, if you will, like raw milk. Our milk comes from a distributor that might come from New York, but because we don't have processing plants in New York, it gets shipped to Maryland to make its way back to New York, as an example, right? But or tomato. We don't buy like our grocery list that we have for our households. We buy a lot of actually meals and processed products that are aiming to get more minimally processed, but because, and again, there's lots of classes on this if you're interested, but because we have gotten used to believing that we don't have time to cook, and so kitchens have been decommissioned at an institutional level, we are doing more reheating than actually cooking. What that translates into, to get to your question, is we aren't buying a lot of product direct from farmers. We know the importance of farms as an economic engine in the state of New York and in the state of Massachusetts, and in every state that has agriculture at its core. But to be clear, we have never, nor would we ever say this particular product is no good. It is more, how do we create climate smart policies in the way that agriculture can diminish some of its impacts that it's causing on the environment. Sparsha mentioned again the implications of biodiversity, which are extraordinary, and this isn't a single issue of food. So, we have a vast network. I know you all, I'm sure, shop at your farmers markets, particularly as the days are getting longer and warmer and the products are more in demand and supply. We know that, again, our connection is also around food SNAP, right? And the way in which we're supporting our farmers markets with public dollars in the form of federal benefits from SNAP, right? And how we can be supporting farmers in that sense. But also, I just need to be explicitly clear. We know that eating less red meat and less dairy is helpful to our personal health, whether it's chronic diseases in the form of heart disease, in the form of many cancers and diabetes. We know this to be true. We also know it to be true that the environmental impact of many red meat, ruminant meats, and dairy processes are very detrimental. So we need to be working with partners in places like academic partnerships and even more to understand the impact of environmental practices on farm products. Sure, there can be even better ways to grow cows that are even less impact on the environment than others. But generally speaking, we know the data to be true that ruminant meats and dairy are very land and carbon intensive.
Anything to add?
Not really, just that I think like what you were referencing sort of at the beginning about the challenges of kind of hitting all of these value category goals at the same time, and because of the changes to our sort of things like school facilities or other county or city facilities, and sort of every detail of how our workforces are set up down to union contracts really has moved away from cooking and cooking facilities, and that coupled with what products we are buying is those, David, you mentioned sort of those demand signals, just rebuilding our regional food systems and supporting, producers and farmers who might be able to transition away from problematic forms of animal agriculture, like the procurement is so far from, in many cases, I'll say in Massachusetts, like I just, was in a meeting last week and learned that, I think it's fine, I hope I can say this, that we, like, every school district gets a certain amount of commodity with dollars that they can basically use, and it's almost like a free store to buy things that the federal government is actually purchasing, and Boston didn't actually use all of that because the animal agriculture products available in the form that are needed based on the facilities and Boston Public Schools does not actually meet our nutrition standards. And so the entire way these systems are set up and the ability to sort of communicate if there are farmers and producers who are interested in climate smart practices, like they, those, we were really rebuilding those systems and those lines of communication so that we can even have those demand signals.
And like, so because you couldn't buy it, that unfortunately means that some other city will. And it's gonna be super cheap for them to do it, and so it's just shifting around, but until we get to actually like maybe not putting so much of that into the marketplace for our most vulnerable young people, we have challenges ahead of us.
I'm gonna send it over to that end. Feel free to weave in, I'm gonna do a speed round too, coming back to me, and then we're gonna open it up to the audience. So feel free to answer that question about farmers and agriculture, but also what other cities are leading and or what other kind of strategies and innovations are ready to scale, maybe that you wanna mention.
So I think one thing I'm thinking a lot about is this kind of phrase of eat less better, which I like a lot, and so if we're thinking of something like regenerative agriculture, sort of switching to a model which is better for the cows, better along a number of dimensions, we can use potentially less land as well. The U.S. Land can only support about 61% of the current beef supply if we switch to that model. So factory farms that have put a lot of small farmers out of business are actually what enable the production of a lot of cheap meat to meet the demand. So if the demand declines, right, then we can produce high quality meat and have a number of health and environmental benefits as well. And I think farmers would sort of, I do think there's a way to speak to farmers about this where they see the benefits to them, right? Because they're being put out by oftentimes sometimes the big corporations, the big business farms, right, that come in. So I think there's just a lot of win-wins when we think about the production side and the demand side, when we put the supply and the demand together, which sometimes I don't always see kind of being done intuitively.
Yeah, I just need to interject too, because it's important to recognize too that these are livelihoods for farmers, right? These are often generational farms, and imagine what it must feel like. Be like, you're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
Like it's that is not the intent, but the impact, of course, can be felt in that way.
Yeah,
I think.
absolutely.
That's why we're gonna do it together.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's where learning, thinking a bit about sort of I'm seeing this pop up in some reports. Sort of what do farmers actually want? We don't have a great sense of that because who represents farmers oftentimes is not always the small and medium farmers. It's the big ones again. So I think looping in farmers, thinking about farmers more than we are is really important.
So I'll maybe just because I recognize I want to have some time for questions. So maybe reacting to a few things. So first, just on what Sparja said. So it is something we're trying to work on a little, more in the space of agroforestry, which is a type of perennial practice that is known to sequester lots of carbon in the soil. It's being done a lot in other countries, not so much here. And so one thing we'll put it out in the universe we're trying to get funding for is how do we actually talk to farmers about the policy changes that might sway what they're doing and which ones actually will be effective and what will the impact be. So putting that out there for everyone. I just want to say I think just reflecting on this conversation, I think it comes to this point where this is hard. It's hard work. And I think there are signals going to farmers around doing more climate smart practices. There's USDA funding, there are a lot of pilot things out there. there's, you know, cities passing good food purchasing saying we wanna align with certain values. But then there's like all the stuff in the middle, which I kind of think is like what Eliza and Kate are talking about, that make those signals really hard. Like it's not a normal market where I like make a t-shirt and sell it and people buy it or they don't. I mean, there's like all these other factors. And I think what I want to say is just, you know, I think sometimes food is left out of this climate conversation despite its impact. We heard from Walter at the beginning, like a third of emissions come from the food system. It gets left out because this is hard, but I think the fact that it's hard shouldn't steer us away from doing it. And I think we're seeing, you know, even if it takes time, like getting started, finding the starting points, chipping away at it bit by bit is really effective. And I think, you know, we'll see 1, 2, 5 years from now, other cities looking at what Boston and New York have done and being able to do that. And us at Harvard also looking at what Boston and New York have done and, you know, being able to do it here as well, so, you know.
Exactly. Yeah, and speaking to that, just as a final thing, Eliza and Kate, what other cities do you look to? What kind of strategies are working well, and how do you share with across cities?
Yeah.
Let's speed round, because then we're gonna open it up.
Well, I love, this is really a funny anecdote, pictures of Milan that we went to Milan as well, and I love that they also like are giving away wine and olive oil. It's just the cultural differences are fascinating. There's a lot to learn in the global context, a lot of, and vice versa, big and small. There's not, everybody has a lesson in some way for us to learn from.
All right. Okay, well, wonderful. We are gonna open it up. We're gonna take 3 questions, and then we're gonna try to answer them, or at least 1 or 2 of them.
Yes.
And then we're gonna end, but all of us, or at least most of us, can linger a bit. So we're gonna go with the 2 of you there, and then you. So we'll start with you in the pink.
Sure, Nita Bockert, I have to just say who I am, Nestle Purina. So we are a big food company, so this has all been very interesting, working with farmers and whatnot. David, you talked about the reduction. I think both you and Kate talked about the reduction in your food. From an emissions perspective, I think you guys indicated a 16% reduction in your meals. How exactly did you guys go about doing that if it wasn't through the procurement? Was it just completely recipe changes, or what did you guys do and how did you measure that?
Yeah. Okay, we're gonna take that and add this question.
I'm
Because
sorry,
we might have to weave it in.
I'm sorry if my question's a little more mundane. You mentioned that when you translate something in the school system, you have to translate it to 23 different languages. How do you cater to a classroom with kids from all over the world?
Yeah.
What would a typical menu look like? Are you trying to create a global menu, whatever that means? Or are you trying to get them exposure to, how does that work?
Beautiful. Okay, we can weave those 2 together. Actually, let's take those 2 and then we'll try to get to yours. So I'll just quick start with Harvard. I mean, there's a variety of things. Definitely, we've teamed up with the Humane Society to train our chefs in cooking more delicious plant-based food. John Yi here has brought over chefs from China to train our chefs and their chefs on plant-based cooking. We've also kind of used defaults and things like that at events and things like that to kind of move toward more plant-based or just more carbon-friendly foods. So not always plants, but maybe away from things like the ruminant meats and dairy that Kate was talking about. But it's slow and it's cultural and it's not, there's never been a top-down thing, at least at Harvard.
So for us, it is procurement. It is buying less dairy, but where possible, buying less red meat where possible, and that's undergirded by our New York City food and nutrition standards for everything that we serve. And so we have in this last round set minimums for the number of times that whole food plant-based proteins can be served, and maximums for the number of times a week that red meats can be served in particular. Quickly, like schools, it's really hard to decrease dairy because of our federal nutrition guidance. But in other places, it's not, like our Department of Corrections and what we're feeding to people in holding. As it relates to recipes, fantastic question. We have, for the last 2 years, been working with an organization called Wellness in the Schools, which creates, everything that we put on menus in our schools has to be approved by 75% of kids. And so, like, if something is too spicy, like, it's about developing the language, not like yuck or yum, but like, what didn't you like, and testing out and then really developing those recipes. So because the city is really diverse, so are our menus. Of course, there's like the pizza and nuggets, but there's also, again, these plant-powered Fridays where we're really introducing, and now over the course of the broader week, more culturally inclusive, flavor profiles that reflect some of our more dominant populations. Southeast Asian, Latina, there's a lot, and they're always growing and developing more recipes around that.
Right, so we're gonna have to take your question up here. No, sorry, we're gonna have to, because it's not me, it's the clock. So it is 3 o'clock. Thank you all for coming to this session. Thank you so much.